So I waited a day or two for things to settle down a bit to put this video together to discuss specifically whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is open. Now, you may know we got an announcement from both Iran, the United States, and Pakistan, also Israel, that there is a tentative memorandum of understanding in place that will be signed on Friday, June 19th. However, lots of questions about whether the strait currently is open or closed. I want to put that to bed. Also discuss what are the major issues facing not just the opening of the strait, but the short-term, long-term of that. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Well, we had this note by the president over on Truth Social. The deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is now complete. Congratulations to all. I hereby fully authorize the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and simultaneously herewith authorize the immediate removal of the United States naval blockade. Ships of the world, start your engines, let the oil flow. I stay apolitical on this channel all the time. I do not demonstrate my political allegiance. However, Mr. President of the United States, don't friggin' say that unless it's true, because you are jeopardizing the lives of merchant mariners. If ships read that and started sailing for the Persian Gulf, we would have a problem out there because the strait is not open at this point. Matter of fact, what we get later on is corrections to that, not the least of which he announced the immediate removal of the U.S. naval blockade. U.S. Central Command said, no, it's not. The blockade is still in effect for ships going to Iranian ports until Friday and an agreement is signed or they're directed otherwise. So the military of the United States is not abiding by that note right there. And neither is the commercial ships, I might add. So let's take a look at this and break it down for you. All right, this is a live feed off marine traffic. Now, note a couple of things. Ships are not broadcasting their AIS, that's their transponder signal, when they're using this southern channel. This is what's referred to as the Omani channel. Up north, this is the Iranian channel. This is the toll booth, basically, that the Iranians are using. And smack dab in the center of these yellow lines, that is the international identified channel. This is the area we think is mined. And what you don't see going through there right now is a lot of shipping. There are these beacons out here using the term Handala. I talked about this in my last episode. That goes back to 1969. It is a name for a cartoon figure to depict Palestinian refugees. And you see it being used here by both Iran, the United States. We think these are markers or potentially drones out here. But what we are not seeing right here is large-scale movements through the Strait of Hormuz right now. This is a recording put out by Marine Traffic. It shows you the last 24 hours sped up here quite a bit. The only visible movement you see through the strait at this time is through the Iranian channel here. That inbound lane that comes in here between Qishim and Larak Island, you see a red tanker coming in that way, and then outbound, a red tanker coming out. That's all you see. You do not see ships transiting that Omani channel, as I mentioned, because those ships are running dark. And then this is Kepler from 12 to 14 June, showing you transits. Kepler is the owner of Marine Traffic. They have done these kind of composites throwing together, and you can see here the number of vessel crossings. Again, these are those that are broadcasting via AIS. So 10 on 12 June and 4 on 14 June. So what I did is I went through the maritime sites and pulled out what I think are the most significant news sources to give you the best kind of picture of what's happening with the strait. Normally on Sundays, I do a week in review recap of the strait, but obviously with everything developing so fast, I thought it would be a good idea to put this video together today to give you an idea. So first, this is a Reuters story on June 16th out of G-Captain. Qatar Energy is ready to restart LNG output, reach current capacity in 1 month. We've seen Qatari LNG carriers coming out. Matter of fact, we just had the 7th one come out. We believe those ships are coming through that southern Omani channel, being protected by the U.S. military. Next, we have a story over at Tradewinds. The big names in very large crude carriers are 2 million barrels or more, are flocking to the Gulf as Strait of Hormuz reopening looms. Angelicos and Sinacor keep sending ships to the Gulf of Oman as brokers promise a rate bonanza. Take you back over to marine traffic for a second. So, empty, very large crude carriers heading toward the Gulf. This shows you all ships. Red are tankers. So let's go ahead and clean this up a bit. We're going to go with crude oil tankers, and we are going to limit their sizes to over 200,000 deadweight tons, because that is usually what we see for very large crude carriers. And we'll change them to in ballast only. So basically empty crude carriers. And here you can see a wave of very large crude carriers all heading out of Asia right now. Very few of them are heading on that southern route here, heading around the Cape of Good Hope, heading toward the Atlantic, whether to the United States, to Nigeria, to Brazil, to the Gulf Coast, to Venezuela or Brazil, but a huge number of them, empty, very large crude carriers heading up here. Some are heading over here into the Red Sea to get to Yanbu, but a lot more can be heading up into this area, and that kind of confirms the story we had. That takes us to this Greg Miller story over at Lloyd's List, how the Strait reopening could impact the very large crude carrier rates in the Middle East and the Atlantic. So the Baltic Exchange, Middle East Gulf, that's what they call the Persian Gulf, to China index is at $412,888 per day, which is absolutely phenomenal, but it is completely hypothetical because there are no ships doing that run. The Atlantic Basin, the VLCCs that are sailing across the Atlantic, are based on actual figures. They're running at about $100,000 a day. Now, according to Greg, if the Strait reopens, the Persian Gulf rates are still predicted to exceed Atlantic rates, while the Atlantic rates are expected to be buoyed by fewer ballasters. That means empty voyages coming back. If you go back and look for the fourth quarter 2026, what are going to be the kind of the future freight rates contracts for the Middle East Gulf, the Persian Gulf to China, that route is at $181,163 per day. So for the end of the year, that's what they're predicting those rates are going to be. That's more than double the rate from the U.S. Gulf to China rate at $86,314. So we're already starting to see those rates start fluctuating a bit, and they're waiting for the opening of the Persian Gulf. Now, there are issues associated with that. So one of the big questions has got to be whether or not ships go into the Persian Gulf, and what's the cost of those ships? Because while Greg is talking about freight rates, there's a couple other issues at play here. Dave Osler over at Lloyd's has two stories, one on 15 June, one on 16 June, that is talking about war risk rates and how they're kind of yo-yoing as the underwriters watch politics unfold. So the 15 June story talks about double-digit quotes, but most seem to be going a lot lower. There's no clear going rate as pricing varies by the hour. So if anybody's telling you they know what the war risk rate is to go into the Persian Gulf right now, they're not telling you the truth, because it's going to depend on the ships, the owners. There's a lot of variables in place. This is insurance. There's no set quote rates in insurance. It all depends on a myriad of factors. War risk is the insurance you need should your ship suffer damage due to war. Normal insurance doesn't cover it. It's like flood insurance on a house. If your house suffers flooding and you don't have flood insurance, you're not covered. But the prospect of a $5 billion loss is receding. Now, Dave's follow-up story on this, owners and marine insurers face snap judgments over fragile stabilization in the Strait of Hormuz. So within the piece, Dave notes this: among the many other counseling caution was Lars Lang, the Secretary General of the International Union of Marine Insurance. Quote, even if the Strait of Hormuz is open, that doesn't immediately mean it is open immediately. It will take at least a few days and cooperation between all stakeholders to establish a safe corridor for passages, end quotes. Remarks from some leading ship owners suggest a degree of anxiety out there, and those of more conservative bent could even hold off for several weeks until firm evidence is in of route's viability. Legal grounds for doing so could be sought in the shape of the war risk clauses in the existing charter parties, most of which are based either on the 2013 Con Wartime or the 2025 Voyage War iterations. This means that owners and masters can refuse orders if, in their reasonable judgment, a vessel or its crew are at risk. The article goes on. Marine underwriters will also be trying to figure things out. As Lloyd's List reported on Monday, the hull war risk market in London currently lacks direction, as underwriters are still thinking through the implications of the deal. Feedback from market participants suggests that quotes are typically wide-ranging now, with pricing for a one-week trip anywhere between 1.5 and 8% expressed as a fraction of hull value. Risk assessment will remain highly sensitive to the political and military profile of the vessel, its flag state, and its ownership. Prior to the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran in late February, additional protections tended to be nominal at worst and were often waived altogether. It may take some time for that level of confidence to return. Quote, "We are looking for clear evidence of a stable, predictable new normal before we consider the current geopolitical hazards fully mitigated," unquote, said an anonymous underwriter. Until we see a consistent return to historical transit volumes, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most complex environments for marine risk assessment. The article concludes, the wider insurance industry is now tasked with working out how much the war will have costed. Earlier projections that the conflict could represent a $5 billion loss event now look to have been wide of the mark, but one way or another, the bill will be costly. Marine lines will represent a fair share of the payment. Claims for many, if not most, of the 40 or so vessels damaged during the war, which include at least 3 total losses, will end up at Lloyd's. There will also be payouts running to the low hundreds of millions of dollars for non-physical damage loss of hire claims from charterers or vessels trapped in the Persian Gulf in recent months. Market sources suggest that there have been pushback from underwriters in some cases who argue that as a handful of vessels were able to escape, others should have been able to escape too. As far as can be established, these disputes are still at the stage of negotiations. In sum, the current landscape requires extreme caution from owners and marine insurance alike. Wow, okay. So I think Dave does a fantastic job of looking at this issue and breaking it apart. Now, understand there are other issues also at play here. It's not just oil tankers, which we seem fixated on all the time. There are other sectors that are impacted. For example, Shishin Shen has this article over at Lloyd's, Hormuz reopening to free 300,000 TEU, those are 20-foot equivalent unit containers, but rate impact still hinges on Red Sea return. The opening of the Strait of Hormuz will release some 50 container ships, but this represents less than 1% of global capacity. Carriers are prioritizing evacuating stranded vessels over restoring Persian Gulf services, with war risk premiums expected to remain elevated in the near term. The bigger question for rates is whether liners will return to Red Sea routes, though a rapid shift back is unlikely while regional stability remains uncertain. I think Shishin is exactly right. Because you get this story from Mike Schuller over at G Captain, Maersk is keeping significant cargo restrictions and emergency surcharges in place across the Persian Gulf, offering the latest sign that commercial shipping remains far from normal despite recent announcements of a U.S.-Iran agreement. We are not seeing the opening of the strait yet, obviously. That is the big issue, and there are a lot of questions about how the strait will open. Understand, if the U.S. and Iran sign the MOU on Friday, and the U.S. announces no blockade, Iran announces, hey, no toll booth anymore, that doesn't mean we go back to 138 ships going through a day. This story by Lloyd's by Richard Mead. How will the Strait of Hormuz reopening work? Until the agreement is signed, the U.S. naval blockade and Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority transit permissions requirements both remain in force. Iran and Oman are negotiating a new traffic management mechanism, with Iran signaling it will eventually charge for navigation and safety services. Ship owners face uncertainty over sequencing, naval escorts, and whether Iran will accept any foreign military presence in the waterway. So again, I think Richard hits on a lot of key issues there. How exactly are you going to open up this strait? We see it echoed over at Splash 24/7, with the Hormuz threat level staying severe despite this peace breakthrough, as noted by Sam Chambers. Just had an attack on a ship transiting through the strait the other day. A Hong Kong flag vessel was hit by either a missile or a unmanned surface vessel, suffered extreme damage to the hull. Fortunately, there were no crew members that were injured. In the meantime, You've got the Europeans arriving on scene. The French carrier strike group, the Charles de Gaulle, the British, and others are arriving on scene. But Europeans are wary of committing naval power to Hormuz. This is a Bloomberg story talking about this. They want to ensure that there is no weaponry flying between them before they will go in and help to clear Iranian mines from the key waterway. If you want a really good synopsis, a one article kind of go-to, then go to this one. Paul Morgan over at G-Captain. Hormuz is reopening. Shipping's old playbook isn't, as the reports of a deal between the U.S. and Iran are top headlines. Again, ship owners will be looking at the financial implications and alternatives if Iran's plan to charge ships for passing through the Strait of Hormuz becomes a negotiating footnote in the deal. Now, Paul does a great job here of summarizing the events that have took place, but he picks up here with the framework peace agreement. Now, the strait is expected to reopen within 30 days, but embedded in the reported framework is a provision that could shape the commercial calculus of Gulf shipping. Iran and Oman are expected to jointly define the future administration of maritime services in the strait. Tehran has signaled that it intends to play a much larger role in managing transit, potentially including fees or service charges that ship owners may find difficult to ignore. Now, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, this is that new Iranian body that's administered by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, began requiring vessels to obtain prior permits before transiting. The 5 Gulf Cooperation Council states immediately filed a formal notification with the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, warning shipping companies not to comply. The legal basis for Iran's position is at best contested. Under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, a coastal state may charge for specific services actually rendered to a vessel, but may not levy a general toll for the right of transit passage through an international strait. This is Article 37. I've talked about this quite a bit on the channel, that Iran by itself cannot do that. Yes, there are places that do this, Turkish Straits, the Danish Straits, but they do provide pilotage and other requirements because they're completely within the territorial waters of those nations. The Strait of Hormuz is not in the territorial waters of Iran. There's portions of it that are, but the international portion, the one where the channel is actually in Omani waters. But still, Article 37 of UNCLOS does require transit passage. In other words, the 5 GCC states have the right to move in and out to access the open oceans. But where this story is really interesting to me is the insurance. Before the crisis, an additional war risk premium for Gulf voyages ran at approximately 0.1% of hull and machinery. By mid-March, it had reached 2.5% for a 7-day period. Some stranded vessels paid up to 10%. Lloyd's List reported quotes of $10 million to $14 million in war risk coverage for a 5-year-old VLCC, very large crude carrier with U.S. connections. Most of the world's protection indemnity clubs, the insurers that cover third-party liabilities, they cover about 90% of the global merchant fleet, canceled war risk extensions within 72 hours of the conflict beginning. JP Morgan estimated that roughly 329 vessels in the Gulf required coverage. That represented about $352 billion in insurance exposure. The U.S. set up the International Development Finance Corporation with $20 billion to provide marine reinsurance, with Chubb as the lead partner. But this was really friggin' late. I mean, this is weeks after this all happened, and $20 billion doesn't come close to covering the insurance value that was needed. The fact that a government backstop of that scale is necessary illustrates how complete the private market withdrawal had been. Now, I do differ a bit on this, because commercial market did come back with war risk insurance. One of the reasons that the war risk insurance locked up that first week is because the shipping companies are the war risk insurance providers. They're part of those P&I clubs. And they wanted to make sure that should ships get hit, there's enough pool of funding available to fund that. The problem with the U.S. was they never got the additional money online soon enough to do it. It goes on, even at the post-ceasefire rate of approximately 1%, a VLCC with a $110 million account is $1.1 million per transit. That repricing is not temporary. The Lloyd's Joint War Committee has expanded its high-risk designation to cover the entire Persian Gulf. Now add that Iranian service fee, and the arithmetic becomes stark. A VLCC carrying approximately 2 million barrels of crude. The ad hoc wartime fee of $2 million per vessel translates to $1 per barrel of cargo carried. At that level, combined with the war risk premium now embedded in Gulf trading, the economics of routing a supertanker around the Cape of Good Hope instead begins to look attractive. Despite adding 12 to 18 days to a Gulf-Europe voyage and approximately $1 million to $2 million in additional fuel and hire costs, it's essential to understand what the Cape comparison actually measures. The Cape of Good Hope is not an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz for Gulf loading vessels. Every tanker departing Ras Tanura, the Qatari LNG terminals, or Jebel Ali must pass through the strait. What the Cape avoids is the second risk gate, the Houthi-threatened Bab el-Mandab and the Suez Canal. Paul kind of sums it up here. The math is unforgiving. VLCC heading from the Gulf to Europe, the combined burden is going to be approximately $1.6 to $1.8 million. The Cape diversion costs approximately $1 to $1.4 million. At any positive fee above approximately to $200,000 to $300,000, it's going to be cheaper. He goes on here, the calculus is no less compelling for the container and general cargo trades. All four of the world's largest container liners, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, have suspended Hormuz transits as of early March 2026, and the Cape of Good Hope has been the default routing for Asia-Europe since the Houthi campaign. The Cape route adds 10 to 14 days, 3,500 nautical miles is added to a standard Shanghai to Rotterdam voyage, pushes bunker consumption up by 30 to 40%, adding about 1.2 to 1.8 million in fuel costs. On a per container basis, that translates to a Cape diversion premium of approximately $100 to $180 per TEU. War risk insurance for the Red Sea, which is settled at about $50 to $100 per TEU. The Drewry World Container Index had Shanghai to Rotterdam at $3,180 per 40-foot TEU for the week ending 17 April. Asia-Europe routes as a whole are running 25 to 40% above pre-crisis levels, with an estimated 5 to 7% of global container fleet capacity absorbed by the longer routing. That's removing 1.3 to 1.8 million TEUs from market capacity. That takes us to Paul's summation here. The Islamabad Declaration, whether by design or diplomatic impression, has handed Iran something of enduring strategic value: the internationally acknowledged right to administer and implicitly to charge for passage through a corridor carrying a fifth of the world's oil trade. That is a form of sovereign leverage that no subsequent negotiation will easily remove. The question is not whether Iran will use it, but at what price and under what political conditions. Paul wraps his piece up with this: the Strait of Hormuz will reopen, traffic will resume, but the era in which a Gulf voyage was simply a matter of loading cargo, paying a canal toll, and making your ETAs over. For the foreseeable future, Gulf fixtures, charter negotiations, and insurance renewals are likely to carry an additional line item that did not exist before February 2026. The cost of geopolitical uncertainty expressed in dollars per barrel. The Strait of Hormuz may reopen, but restoring the confidence that once underpinned global trade through the region could prove far more difficult than reopening the waterway itself. I will echo that and say further that this amount of challenges to freedom of the sea, the dark fleet, geopolitical, attacks on shipping, all of that is making the Great Blue Commons, what is the world ocean, and our ability to move over 12 billion tons a year of cargo seamlessly at risk. It is going to make it more expensive, more difficult to move. We are not going to see, lack of gas and diesel in developed countries. You will see that in lesser developed countries that can't afford to pay the higher prices. And this is going to create big problems on global shipping. The fact that navies and nations are using their forces to challenge freedom of the sea. It doesn't matter if you're Iran, the United States, Russia, Britain, France, it doesn't matter. All nations are doing this now. We're seeing this being done. And the question becomes, are we going back to contested seas where the seas are no longer wide open for travel? I will note that while 80% of the globe's trade is unaffected by all this, it's moving seamlessly, there are no problems. It does have issues because when you contest about 20% of global trade, that does have a domino effect. Gets more expensive to buy fuel. Bunker fuel goes up. It becomes, you change trade patterns. You move where cargo is coming from. You start imposing sanctions. You start politicizing global trade. And we've seen this done. The Trump administration has done this with tariffs, and now we're seeing it done by the Iranians with their control over the Strait of Hormuz. And let's not forget, we saw it previously with the Houthi in the Red Sea. We've seen it with the Russians and the Ukrainians in the Black Sea. We've seen it with anchor drags up in the Baltic. We've seen confrontations between the Philippines and the Chinese in the South China Sea. I mean, this is nothing new. The issue here is its prevalence and how much it's happening now, much more common than ever before. It's a good thing I started What's Going On with Shipping 5 years ago, I guess. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a big thumbs up, and if you can,